Yeah, it's always recorded. There's the clicker. That's right. Laser's right up above.
Okay, this next button.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, our next speaker is Ray Crothers. We'll talk about dating with depression and some other stuff.
Love on its own is scary and exciting and frustrating, and yet it's the goal, right? Happily ever after. But what if Prince Charming suffers from severe depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, the fear of letting anyone in? I don't know about you, but that wasn't in my fairy tales growing up. Cinderella didn't have to convince Prince Charming that she wasn't going anywhere before he decided that she was the one. And all of her dust and dirt got brushed off and covered up because she couldn't possibly be good enough for true love with the rags that she wore every day. But why not? Why aren't we talking about it? I am a hopeless, die-hard, cry at the end because they are so in love romantic, and yet still, I've never heard of someone like me with PTSD from sexual trauma, deep depressive episodes, and whirling gender dysphoria get their happy ending. So here I am, asking you to let me write my own. What you just heard was the opening paragraph of a query letter that I wrote to pitch this book, Dating with Depression and Some Other Stuff. I'm Ray Carruthers. Thank you for being here. When you begin a book proposal, you have to let the publishing company know that you know what's out there. In this case, Albert Whitman and Company, a popular publisher looking for content to help young adults grow intellectually, mentally, emotionally. They needed to know that I was going to add something new to a market that is continuously flooded with repetitive material. How do you do that? Start reading. Kira Van Gelder writes a popular book about relationships and mental health. In her book, however, she targets an audience that was much more specific than mine would, Buddhists. I would be targeting a much broader audience with just young adults in general. And in addition, her book only details some trials with relationships, and then trust me, they are fascinating and hilarious. It's not nearly the focus of her book, rather it's her recovery story in general. Or there's the handbook, how-to method. Two other examples of dating and relationships with mental health issues, but they do so in a completely different genre. Using creative nonfiction allows me to write a story for my audience to latch onto, to write about characters that they can root for, and still use the same amount of ample research that they do in these books, but do so in a way that my audience can be intrigued by. Finally, the way that this subject is most often written by is married people. Diane Mintz details her story with her husband and their respective mental health issues. The only problem is that she is a married woman, and she is telling her story as such. I would be a college-age student writing to other college-age people and hopefully encouraging them to take care of their mental health earlier rather than later. In addition, I would be an emerging adult and have that perspective of somebody that is learning how to date, communicate, listen, all of that all at once, while also coping with mental health concerns. Once you just shown a publishing company that you know what's out there and that you're going to bring something new to the table, you have to start formatting your chapters. To do this, I had to think critically about my audience and the content that was going to best fit their desires. These decisions were based on research elements like blog postings of other people that are dealing with mental health concerns in their relationship, as well as my personal constraints, like what am I willing to share about my relationship? And what if my family reads this someday? Hello. In addition, there is no set standard for organization or structure in creative nonfiction. So thankfully, that allowed me to get creative in my structure, but also forced me to get creative in my structure. As you will come to see, every single one of my chapters, as creative nonfiction calls for, groups one true or pivotal story in my relationship, as well as a major area of research through interviews, scholarly material, conference attending, and finally, room for reflection. The way that I chose to structure my chapters was based on a number system. The introduction would detail the story of a time that my partner Bryce got extremely drunk And the only way that we could communicate his mental state was through a number system. 1 being actively fainting or vomiting, 10 being stone cold sober. He never got to that point that night, however. And I used this number system that has since been transposed for an easy way for us to communicate our mental health standing today. As you will see, every other chapter uses a number from this system to detail what our lives look like at a given time. The first chapter, starting all over again, would detail how we came to be, how we met, which is, trust me, a funnier story than you can imagine, as well as research on the how-tos of dating when you're mentally ill, which are just as generic as you can imagine, which I show through my reflection. And then concepts like how and when do you bring up your mental health concerns to a partner. The second chapter would be Our 10 is Their 6. This would focus much more on the signs and symptoms of our respective mental illnesses, as well alongside a story of how even on our best days, we're functioning at a level that is just above average for everyone else. The next 2 chapters would get into some of the application of these mental illnesses. With doing it, I swear it gets better, getting into the nitty-gritty of how PTSD and performance anxiety affect sexual lives in a couple, alongside sex ed for the mentally ill, which, trust me, really hard to find, and you have to do some digging to get research on that one. 3, Not Too Great, Not in Constant Suffering, would do a lot of what our lives look like on a daily basis, alongside research on what generational impacts we have on dating. So hookup culture, dating apps, things like that that are affecting us in our daily lives. The next 3 chapters would get into some of the more difficult subject matter. Collateral damage is a chapter that is focused much more on argumentation, but I'll get into that in a little bit. 1, hitting rock bottom and crawling back up again refers back to our system of hitting the worst of the worst. It is the area where our mental health hits a point some days that scares both of us. Alongside research on college-age suicide, the prevalence of it, and its prevention. Finally, asking for help with a +1 would round out our story. It would get into stories of how Bryce and I have gotten into, fallen out of, dreaded, really needed therapy, alongside research on couples therapy, bringing up therapy to a reluctant partner, how to break up with a therapist, all information that you wouldn't necessarily know when you first start getting into taking care of your mental health. And finally, the chapter that I completed for the class was collateral damage. This chapter was focused almost entirely on the worst fight that I ever got into with my partner, and how our respective traumas impact our ability to communicate. There are 3 large pieces of research that you will hear in the section that I will read. 1 is interview material from a marriage and family therapist and psychology professor here at Mount. Also, dissertation material from Nikki Truselli, a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University, and a journal article published by the Journal of Family Psychology. There are 2 prefaces I would like to make before I read. The first is that this is a patchwork version of the second half of the chapter. It is not nearly the whole thing, but it hopefully gives examples of how creative nonfiction uses research material in its writing. The second is that creative nonfiction asks you to find your voice. And to do that, and to be authentic to both myself and the story, the chapter does use profanity where appropriate. Sorry. He took a right turn into a park entrance and pulled into an open spot. I couldn't turn to look at him, but in my peripherals, I saw him get out of the car. He rested his hands on his head for just a second before getting back in and closing the door. I could only look past him, and in the direction of the steering wheel, I saw the sign. Dick Goddard Dog Park. As we sat in silence, I couldn't process what just happened. I could only ask myself, who the fuck is Dick Goddard? I looked it up later and found out he was a Fox 8 News weatherman in Cleveland, Ohio. He died last year. Finally, all I could say to break the silence was, what the fuck was that? Since when do we fucking do that? I don't know why I was cussing. In past relationships, I would have yelled back. It was one of 2 models of conflict I'd ever seen at home, and it beat the silent treatment any day. So, I had grown from the little girl that thought she needed to scream to be heard, and out of the abusive relationship that took my voice away to begin with. But it still surprises me just how easily my body springs back into defense when it was the only side I got to play for 5 years. This shouldn't be shocking, though, because as doctoral candidate Nikki Truselli explains, our first experiences with relationship conflict as we come into adulthood determine our attachment styles moving forward. This is not that. Bryce is not him. My dissociated ears had locked in on the sounds coming from the dog park, so I missed the beginning, but Bryce was still apologizing when I started coming up for air. And the I'm sorry's and I love yous continued until we were able to kiss and make up. But our story doesn't end here. Just like a fight isn't actually over after the last tear dries, especially if you only solve the conflict that's spewed out from the surface. Those buried reasons are still rotting in your gut, and if you don't dig them up soon, you're bound for another round of petty texts and eye rolls. Like hot coals sparking a fire that you thought you put out when you really only put out the flames. So, how do we douse the coals for good? Talk it out. Research shows, and I hope to God this does not come as a surprise to you, that talking to your partner reduces negative effects on a relationship. To be more precise, a recent study found that the key component in having a productive interaction and handling conflict is communicating your thoughts and feelings, which leads to greater empathetic understanding from your partner. This couldn't be more simple, right? People are still getting paid to do studies on this. Why? Because Bryce and I didn't actually communicate any of our thoughts and feelings. That came later that night when he came over to eat Hibachi Express takeout. After hours of discussing where he was mentally, which was much worse than I had suspected, I came to learn that he wasn't yelling at me that day in the car. It was his own brain that he was battling, and I was collateral damage. We're constantly learning about how to recognize our patterns in ourselves, how to be patient with one another when we miss it, and how to adjust for the future. It's the dynamics that need to change. As marriage and family therapist Kevin Meyer says, it's not necessarily the people that need to change, but how they interact with each other. Clearly, the system isn't perfected, but we're working on it. Before I open this up to questions, I'd like to say 3 quick thank yous. First, to Bryce for not just allowing, but encouraging me to take care of my mental health and to write about some intimate details of our relationship. Second is to Dr. Schwartz for not just nominating me, but also encouraging me through my writing, academic, and personal endeavors, and to all of you. Even if you only showed up to listen to some information on biochemistry, you happened to listen to a presentation on one of the most important projects that I've ever completed. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah, so it's a conversation of what makes it to the SCE project. This was just for a creative nonfiction course that I took. Hopefully it comes into fruition. I definitely have lots of ideas for the rest of the chapters. And so if that works out, it could definitely be an SCE project that I work on a couple more chapters, and then maybe even graduate school would be where it actually gets to like show up. But I'll let you know. Yeah.
How do you navigate the challenges of sharing not only intimate personal details of your life, but also your partners and some other people?
Consent. I had the idea and I was like, this is crazy. I should not do this. This is invasive. And I basically sat down with Bryce and I was like, so I want to do this thing, but just for now, it's just for like a class. Like it's not going to leave like me and my professor. And then throughout the process, I did a lot of updating, a lot of this is where I'm at in the research. This is where the chapter I think I'm going to work on. And just being super honest and open with that throughout the process. I think I've gotten to a point with my mental health story where now that I'm in a place where I can take care of myself, I feel more comfortable sharing. And I would say the same for him, most likely, that it gets a little bit easier. So yeah, honesty, consent throughout the whole process was the way for me, and I think that's the way for most people. Although we know creative nonfiction writers that don't do that, and they just write about their families and friends at their own regard with no consent. So that was not the method that I chose to take. So yeah, honesty. Yeah. Yeah.
As you were doing your research, so obviously some of the books you said were very general, generalities. Was there something as you were going through that literature that was like, wow, that surprised me, or that was really interesting? I didn't think like that.
Yeah, within the books that I read in the beginning, so the Kira Van Gelder book, the title is like 3 pages long about Buddhists and love and such. She has these stories in there that, like I said, it's not the focus of her book, but there's these stories that are so fascinating. And it's examples of her trying to use online dating as someone suffering from bipolar disorder, and like they're absolutely hilarious. And I had never thought about it like that because I didn't meet my partner through online dating. I didn't deal with like a lot of the generational impacts that like people in our generation are dealing with in the dating. I'm not dealing with that, thankfully. And she was. And so that was an interesting perspective to read and like kind of get an idea of like what I need to include in this research wise that maybe I didn't deal with in my getting into a relationship or dealing with a partner. But a lot of people do right now. And so that was definitely like, I need to include that. That needs to be something that I take into consideration.
So you mentioned that one of the challenges or I guess benefits of writing creative nonfiction is finding your voice. So
Yeah.
we heard a little bit of your voice. What do you like about it? What do you still think needs to get worked on?
I actually would reformat the chapters. I was actually just discussing with Dr. Schwartz recently about a few of them that I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why did I do that? And that's really fun for me at this point, as I got to put the project down because I did it last semester. So I got to put the project down for a little bit. And then when I got accepted for this, I got to pick it back up and, make it into a presentation. And so I got to read through parts of the chapter for this purpose and be like, well, that sounds good and that doesn't. And that sounds good and that doesn't. And that was a lot of fun. So I think that like if it does make it to SCE time, that it would be really interesting for me to rework the chapters or rework the number system or figure out how I can make it flow even better. And then I'm also still figuring out like what is the appropriate level of using your authentic voice. Because in creative nonfiction, every example I've read, like you latch on to somebody that sounds like somebody, if that makes sense. You latch on to a person that writes like somebody you think you know. And they write so eloquently that you know that person on the other side of the page. And I'm still getting there. I'm still figuring out how to incorporate research in a way that sounds like I'm just tossing it in there, but you don't realize it, but it's actually like an important fact to the story. So I'm still learning and I'm still practicing, but I'm definitely having fun as I do it because it is an interesting process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
This might be more of a comment than a question, and maybe this came up in Dr. Schwartz's class, but in sociology, what you're doing is called an autoethnography. So just in terms of your method and working your mind through it, it might be worth, and also.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it might be worth looking at some of the methodological writing on that. I'm not an expert in that, but I can at least
point.
assume my direction.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Oh, yeah.
If you don't mind sharing, you said it was a funny story, so I want to know, how did you meet your partner?
So shortened version, we met through mutual friends, and he didn't like me. That's like the shortened version of all sort. He did not like me at all for years, and I was like, this kid is so special, and like they were like, no, he's not. Like all of our friends were like, you just gotta let it go. Like he's not that special, and I was like, yes, he is. And he didn't like me, and he told me like, I don't like you, and I was like, you will like me. So here we are. It's been like a couple years. Of us being together, and he did end up liking me. My family still gives him a hard time for it too, because they knew all about him as being like the kid that would never like me. And now he's sitting with them. So like comes full circle a little bit. But yeah, it was a very interesting time. Yeah.
Let's thank our speaker.